All right. Welcome to week 5 of Pacific Northwest Sports weekly updates. I'm really excited to keep doing these for you. And honestly, the positive feedback has been great in terms of wanting to keep recording these. So, actually, I'm switching something up a little bit this week. From here on, and if you don't like this, we can always change it back. But from here on, we're only going to be announcing players of the game for the winning teams. I find often sometimes finding that silver lining by not rewarding, but shouting out the player on the losing team is almost unfair to the rest of that team because while they did lose, that means you're looking for someone to give better credit to. I don't know. Maybe it's a ramble. Maybe that doesn't make sense. But from here on, we're going to go one player of the game or two players of the game for the winning team. Now, if you aren't a fan of that and you want to have players of the game for the losing teams like we've done in weeks past, let's go with that. Hockey season's approaching, so we're going to start having some Kraken updates. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the Mariners here. Now, I think I'll have a more in-depth view next week. But for right now, let's just talk about football and focus on this. Of course, as sports become more and more relevant with things kicking off, hockey, basketball, different things like that, we will talk about those. But right now, let's do football. And again, please shoot emails, leave comments, anything for me to better myself, to become a better person for you to listen to is what I'm trying to accomplish. Let's kick it off in Washington. Your UW Huskies played Arizona and they won 31-24. After a quick 14-0 lead, UW was able to keep it going, but they scored just 17 points the rest of the game. Arizona, if not for a rough start in that very first quarter, with their backup quarterback, might have actually won this game. After the first quarter, again, they were down 14-0. They were able to outscore UW 24-17. Now, Michael Penix didn't have his best game. In fact, he actually didn't even throw a touchdown, which is mind-boggling considering the fast start he's had all year. UW's a good team, and they might have finally found their bell cow. Remember how I've been saying for weeks, UW doesn't have a run game. They don't have a run game. They don't have a run game. Perhaps they found it in Dylan Johnson. Speaking of him, he's actually our player of the game. He had 91 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns on only 16 attempts. Now, UW has a bye week next week, and big shocker, but I think next week they are going to be our game of the week. For those of you who don't know, they're playing Oregon, but we'll have more in-depth on that next week. Over to Eastern Washington, where they played the University of Idaho and actually lost 36-44. Now, this is a tough loss to a rival that's located less than 100 miles away from their school. The Eagles were playing without their starting quarterback, and they used their backup and their third-string quarterback to keep the Vandals on their toes, and it worked, but not well enough. For the Vandals, they just ran the ball over and over and over again, and however they wanted to run it, to the tune of 363 yards. Idaho's player of the game, a sophomore running back Anthony Woods, who rushed for 183 yards and 5 touchdowns on just 24 attempts. Idaho will head down to California to play Cal Poly next week, while Eastern has a bye. Your Central Football Wildcats played Western New Mexico and won 55-17. Talk about stomping out an opponent. After a tough first quarter that ended in a 17-10 lead, the Wildcats broke through in the second with another 17 points, and they never looked back. From the end of the first quarter, Central outscored Western New Mexico 38-7. Perhaps most impressive is that we have 2 player of the games. Redshirt sophomore running back Tyler Flanagan, who had 14 attempts for 143 yards and 4 touchdowns. Defensively, we have junior safety Tanner Volk, who had 2 interceptions. Central will welcome Eastern New Mexico to Ellensburg next week. Now, your PLU Lutz played Whitworth University and lost 13-42. Now, PLU has a tough game with Whitworth. Sometimes when it rains, it pours, and PLU is having a rough year with a 1-3 record. PLU was in this game until they fumbled the ball into Whitworth's arms at the end of the second quarter. JT Munoz returned the ball 33 yards for a touchdown to end the first half. When it rains, it pours, and unfortunately for PLU, that's when it started pouring, and there was no looking back from there. Whitworth's player of the game is quarterback Austin Ewing, who went 15 of 23 for 142 yards and 2 touchdowns. PLU will face Pacific University next week, while Whitworth will play William Met University next week. Over to Oregon. Your Oregon Ducks played Stanford and won 42-6. Oregon won, which is good. But they didn't get into any real rhythm until the third quarter, where they turned it on to the tune of 21 points. At one point, the Ducks were actually down 6-0, but they were able to remember who the heck they are. And again, they turned it on. And Bo Nix really was a big part of that, as he is our player of the game, where he went 27 of 32 for 290 yards and 4 touchdowns. Oregon has a bye next week, and we touched on this earlier. The following week, they will be playing UW. Now, from the game of the week last week, we have Oregon State Beavers, who played Utah and won 21-7. And a gritty win it was. Utah didn't have their starting quarterback in Cam Rising. However, quarterback Nate Johnson, who was their backup, was abysmal. He went 8 for 23 and 101 yards. Now, Utah's receivers didn't necessarily help them, as they dropped a handful of passes, but this game was just diabolical. I mean, it never looked like he got comfortable. And while that's good for Oregon State and what they were able to force the quarterback into feeling, if you're Utah or Utah fan, you got to be wondering, when can we get Cam Rising back? Because your season is slowly slipping away. I understand it's only one loss, and I get it. You have a lot of games left, but you don't have the luxury of losing this game and saying, well, when Cam comes back, we'll be able to turn it on. He hasn't played in, 10 months now? It takes time. And I love Rising. I think he's a great player, and I think he will elevate this team. But you don't have too much time for him to knock the rest off. Now, the Beavers stuck with what they do best, and that's running the frickin' ball. Ironically, that's how Utah did it all these years, right? Tough, gritty, running the ball. We don't care. 8 in the box. We're going to keep shoving it down your throat and see if you can stop us. Oregon State did the same thing. And the Beavers would actually only go into halftime up 7-0, but then in that pound the ball sense, they were able to score in the third and fourth quarter to win this game 21-7. Now, Oregon State's player of the game is Damian Martinez, who, again, pounded the rock 16 times for 71 yards and 1 touchdown. Well, those stats don't stand out on paper. I cannot understate how impressive it was that he just kept on running hard. Oregon State punched Utah in the mouth, and they beat Utah at Utah's own game. Now, John Smith has done amazing things at Oregon State, and I hope he stays there, because his name, just like Jake Dickert's, is being mentioned for that Michigan State opening. But I hope they can put all that behind them and just keep winning. He's building something special there. Now, Utah has a bye next week, and Oregon State's going to face Cal next week. Now, your Portland State Vikings played Montana State and lost 22-38. I don't know what to say here other than dominance. You wouldn't think Portland State actually scored 22 points when you're watching the game, right? Montana State is just so much better than all their opponents this year. And it has in part to do with their defense, but it helps when you have a guy like Sean Chambers. Speaking of which, he's the player of the game. He went 14 of 21 for 143 yards and 3 touchdowns. He also rushed for 118 yards on the ground. Portland State has a bye next week, as well as Montana State having a bye next week. Now, these next 2 games are absolutely crazy, and I think you guys will agree with me, because buckle up. Your Western Oregon Wolves played West Texas A&M and won 37-36. Cardiac Wolves. A back-and-forth game that came down to this. On its own 31-yard line, the Wolves ran 4 straight times to start the drive, to get to the West Texas A&M's 47. 2 plays later, quarterback Gannon Winker threw a nice ball to tight end Cade Hustler for a 41-yard pass. The Wolves then ran the ball 3 times down to the 2-yard line and then had a timeout with just 6 seconds left. After what felt like an eternity for Wolves fans, the Wolves came out in a spread formation and had Brandon Hodge run a slant in which Gannon Winker hit him perfectly to tie up the game. The Wolves would hit the field goal and game over, right? Wrong. The Buffs of West Texas A&M were able to drive the ball down the field and attempt a long field goal, but it just missed, giving the Wolves another win to improve to 2-3 on the year. Now, Western Oregon has a player of the game. They have 2 of them. Gannon Winker, who went 13 of 19 for 232 yards and 3 touchdowns, and Dominique Loggins, who toted the rock 32 times for 125 yards and a single touchdown. Western Oregon will play Western New Mexico next week. Now, your George Fox Bruins played Lewis and Clark and lost 31-37 in double overtime. Remember how that last game I said was intense? Wrong. This game was intense. Now, picture this. George Fox is up 28-10 going into the 4th quarter. All you need is a field goal and to milk the clock and the game's over, right? You would think so. Instead, Lewis and Clark put up 18 points in the 4th quarter. Let me rephrase that, actually. They put up 18 points in the final 10 minutes to force overtime. In George Fox's final 3 possessions of regulation, the Pioneers forced 2 3-and-outs and a punt on what ended up being, I think, around 6 plays. In overtime, each team traded field goals until in the second overtime, Darryl Scott picked off a pass in the end zone with their backs against the wall and gave the ball to his offense to ice the game. And boy, did they answer the bell. Trey Morris found Elijah McGee, who broke multiple tackles on his way to the end zone for the game-winning touchdown. Now, Lewis and Clark's player of the game is senior Trey Morris, who went 17 of 21 for 185 yards and 3 touchdowns. George Fox will face Puget Sound next week, and Lewis and Clark will face Linfield next week. Speaking of Linfield, they played the Bearcats and won 70-14. An absolute beatdown, which is to be expected when you're ranked the number 8 team in the nation. Some big numbers to focus on Linfield. They held the Bearcats to 154 yards of offense, and 59 of those yards came on the final drive. So for those of you who are counting in your brain, they held them to less than 100 yards for essentially the entire game. Now, Linfield's player of the game is Blake Eaton, who went 15 of 19 for 174 yards and 5 touchdowns. Linfield will face Lewis and Clark next week. Williamette will play Whitworth next week. Now, your Eastern Oregon Mountaineers played Arizona Christian University and won 34-0. Donut. That is what you want your defense to do, to force donuts on the scoreboard. And the Mountaineers did just that. Eastern Oregon finally has win number 1 on the season. Maybe this is the kickstart they need to do big things. Now, the Mountaineers player of the game is QB Quincy Glasper, who went 22 of 32 for 333 yards and 2 touchdowns. The Mountaineers will play the MSU Northern Lights next week. Your Southern Oregon Raiders played Montana Tech and lost 21-31. Now, it's an impressive win for Montana Tech, as at one point they were down 14-10. But from there, they were able to score on their next three drives of the game to really pull away. Montana Tech's player of the game is Wyatt Alexander, who had 7 catches for 143 yards and 1 touchdown. And he's been doing this all year. Okay, he's just a baller. Southern Oregon's going to play Rocky Mountain next week, and Montana Tech will play Montana Western next week. On over to Idaho. Your Boise State Broncos played Memphis and lost 32-35. Despite a late comeback, The Despite a late comeback, Memphis was able to hold off the Broncos. Perhaps more disappointing is that Boise State lost this game. Memphis didn't win it. Does that make sense? Probably not, so let me just explain. Boise State's defense is so terrible that they can't stop anything. I mean, you have a kid on offense in Austin Jeanty who scored 4 touchdowns in the game, and you still found a way to lose. He's the fastest Bronco to record 10 touchdowns on the season in Boise State history. What more can this do? What more can this kid do? Last week I said this offense and this team goes as far as Austin Jeanty can go. But at a certain point, you have to realize that the old adage of we'll only go as far as our weakest link is really what matters. And the weakest link, unfortunately, for Boise State is this offense. I mean, come on, Broncos. You got to find a way to reward your offense who's putting up the points. You got to stop something. I mean, this is the opposite of Iowa, right? Iowa, they can shut down opponents and their offense doesn't reward them. And everyone says, oh, well, if the offense could just score. Well, Boise State's offense can score, but you can't stop anyone. So what's the problem here? I mean, if you have a half-decent offense, you're probably if you had a half-decent defense, you're probably undefeated. I mean, this running back can do it for you. 4 touchdowns in one game. Boise State plays San Jose State next week. The Idaho State Bengals lost to Montana 20-28. Now, Idaho State lost this game, but honestly, if not for a rough third quarter, we're probably looking at a win. In a lot of ways, this game is very much an honest dissection of each team's season up to this point. Now, Idaho State can't find a way to put away games, and Montana needs their quarterbacks to play better, and perhaps their O-line. Perhaps if Idaho State doesn't fumble the PAT snap that would have made the game 21-21, momentum shifts and stays with Idaho State. Instead, they miss the PAT, it's 21-20, and the momentum shifts to Montana. Montana's player of the game is Clifton McDowell, who had 20 carries for 92 yards and a touchdown. But let's not forget, he also lost 26 yards throughout the game, bringing his net yardage to 66 yards. Idaho State has a bye next week, and Montana will face UC Davis next week. Your College of Idaho Coyotes played Rocky Mountain and won 45-21. Well, we almost saw the Yotes have another crazy game. In fact, Rocky Mountain was up 21-10 at halftime, but in the second half, the Yotes outscored the Battling Bears 35-0 to take home a dominating victory for homecoming. The Yotes player of the game is senior wide receiver John Schofield, who had 2 rushing touchdowns and 3 receptions for 61 yards and another touchdown. What a homecoming game for the kid. Rocky Mountain will play Southern Oregon next week, and the Yotes will face Arizona Christian next week. Now, Montana, right, we had one game. Carroll Fighting Saints versus MSU Northern, in which Carroll won 43-3. An absolute rout. Carroll wanted to impose their will on the Northern Lights and did so, turning off the lights, as they've now won 11 straight over them. Down 3-0, Carroll decided to put on a show, going up with 40 unanswered points. Now, the Saints player of the game is Duncan Kraft, who rushed the ball 18 times for 60 yards and 2 touchdowns. MSU Northern will face Eastern Oregon next week, and Carroll will take a week off to rest, as this is finally their bye. Wyoming, your Wyoming Cowboys, played New Mexico and won 35-26. You know, there's a stat. It's been told to me a bunch by different coaches and different people throughout the years, and it goes something like, when your special team scores, you will win. Scores, and by this I mean blocked punt, kickoff return for a touchdown, onside kick recovery, something along those lines, not just field goals. You will win a game 70% or some crazy high percentage like that. So essentially, for those of you who got sidetracked by what I was saying, when you score on special teams, 70% of the time you will end up winning the actual game. Now, here's where I think this might be true. I've never actually seen it written down, but that's what it's always been told to me by coaches. After giving up a touchdown on New Mexico's opening drive, Wyoming blocked the PAT, returned it down the field for a 2-point conversion. So they're down 6-2, but that is the scoring chance that says, oh, you're going to win this game now. Well, when special teams can kick, you can also win the game. As kicker John Hoyland went 4 for 4 on field goals, accounting for 12 points in what was a 9-point win. Essentially, special teams forced 14 points for the Cowboys this past week. Game-changing indeed. The Cowboys player of the game is Harrison Wiley, who had 18 rushes for 191 yards and a touchdown. Wyoming will play Fresno State next week. On to Utah. Your BYU Cougars played Cincinnati and won 35-27. The first time for everything. BYU won their first Big 12 conference game. Sitting at 4-1, this team is almost bowl eligible. Some things to note on this game. It was a sellout game of 68,834 people, the largest crowd attendance for BYU since 2009. Head coach Kalani Sitake won his 60th game with the Cougs, and LJ Martin continued his solid play with 16 carries for 66 yards and 2 touchdowns. BYU's player of the game is Max Tooley, who had 16 tackles. BYU has a bye next week. Your Utah State Aggies beat UConn 34-33. But are we supposed to be hyped for a win against one of the worst FBS teams in recent memory? I understand the natural question is, wasn't UConn bowl eligible last year? Yeah, they were, but they are not good this year. They're such a dumpster fire that UConn's starting running back decided to redshirt just so he could enter the transfer portal so he wouldn't burn a year of eligibility. That was 4 games into the season. With all of this adversity, UConn still managed to drive 85 yards down the field and score a touchdown. And the only reason they actually lost this game is because their PAT was blocked. Now, the player game is Cooper Legas. Maybe he's meant to come off the bench and put up these crazy things. Because after true freshman McKay Hillstead, who was injured on a late hit in the third quarter, went down, Legas took over and went 11 of 13 for 204 yards and 3 touchdowns. Utah State will play Colorado State next week. Your Utah Tech Trailblazers played Colorado State and fell to them 20-41. A good valiant fight, but the Trailblazers couldn't stop the Rams. And if it weren't for 2 garbage time touchdowns by the Rams, the score would actually show 20-27. A loss, but not as embarrassing as it sounds. Consider this. Utah Tech put up 349 yards of offense and had the ball working on the ground and in the air. Utah Tech will play Stephen F. Austin next week. Now, the Weber State Wildcats beat Northern Colorado 28-21. I'm just going to be brutally honest when I say this. Weber State did not deserve to win. Or let me say this differently, actually. Weber State's offense did not deserve the win. If not for 3 interceptions on Northern Colorado's final 3 drives, the Wildcats would have lost a game against an unimpressive Northern Colorado team. Weber State's player of the game, Winston Reed, who had 10 tackles and a pick 6. Weber State will host Northern Arizona next week. Now, your Southern Utah Thunderbirds played Central Arkansas and lost 27-29. Now, 1-4, the Thunderbirds are searching for answers. When you can't get your offense going all game until the 4th quarter, it makes a comeback pretty damn hard. And to be fair, if not for a lightning delay at the end of the 3rd quarter, I don't think the Thunderbirds amount any sort of comeback in the 4th quarter. Again, I believe Southern Utah has the pieces to be a competitive team, but it's hard to find the disconnect on the team. And that's up to the coach. He's got to find it. And once they figure out where that disconnect is, hopefully they can fix it and figure out how to rectify this season. It's not over, but it's starting to roll the bad way. Southern Utah will face Tarleton State next week. Now, your game of the week for next week, Wyoming versus Fresno State. Now, I think Wyoming's going to win this game 28-21. The Cowboys are 4-1 in playing 24 in the nation, Fresno State, and welcoming them into Laramie in War Memorial Stadium.
This game is being nationally televised on Fox. Can the Cowboys pull it off? Perhaps. But I believe it has to do with the Cowboys. But what I believe the Cowboys need to do to win this game is run the ball all freaking game. Don't get into obvious passing situations and control the time of possession. Fresno State is a high-flying team, but remember, they beat Purdue by 4 in week 1, and they almost lost to Eastern. They ended up winning by 3 in week 2. Since then, they've torn into Arizona State and Kent State, but those teams are terrible, and I'm pretty sure if they played Eastern right now or any Big Sky team, the Big Sky team would beat those two schools. We'll see what happens, but my money is truly on Wyoming to win this game. Player of the week, Montana State's Sean Chambers. I mean, come on. As a reminder, Chambers, this past game, went 14 of 21 for 143 yards and 3 touchdowns, and also rushed for 118 yards. On the season, he has 845 passing yards for 19 touchdowns, 623 rushing yards, and 8 touchdowns. I would say at this point, he's the front runner for the Walter Payton Award. For those of you who don't know, the Walter Payton Award is the FCS equivalent of the Heisman. Upset of the week, same as the game of the week, right? I think it's going to be Wyoming beating Fresno State. NFL football, the Seahawks play the Giants on Monday Night Football. Unfortunately, there's no update I can give, but go Hawks. Hopefully they can get a win for you, and we can talk about it in next week's episode. As always, guys, I appreciate you guys letting me give you these updates. I love it, and it truly makes me happy to share my voice with you and tell you what I think about the season. I hope you guys enjoy them. Hopefully you like this new idea of only giving player of the games to winning teams. But if you want to switch it up, we can go back to the old way. And if you want to hear some Kraken updates, if you want to hear some Mariner updates, and these other big-time sports, let me know. I'm more than happy to give summaries like, hey, Kraken won 3 games this week. Here's what you need to watch for. Mariners, unfortunately, are eliminated from the playoffs, but here's what you can look forward to. Simple things like this. I'm excited to share these things with you. I love speaking about Pacific Northwest sports. Of course, we got the wall. We got all the things working for us, right? Wyoming wrestling hat. Thank you, Mark Branch. Tons of different things going on, and I love speaking about it. So let me know what I can do to be better for you so you guys want to listen to more. Again, this is Jay with Pacific Northwest Sports. This is week 5. Have a great freaking week.